Okay, so this is a new video on ethical egoism. And the big question here is, should morality be based solely on self-interest? That's what ethical egoism is about. The main idea of this video is that ethical egoists believe you should always act in your self-interest, right? Now, ethical egoism reminds us that self-interest is a virtue. That's a good thing. But I think the negative side is that ethical egoists are mistaken in arguing that it's the only virtue. So to flourish, we should seek self-interest, but not just self-interest. All right, so let's get into this. In the previous section, we found that people are not always selfish or self-interested. The previous section was about psychological egoism. You can see videos on those. So it seems we are capable of acting with regard for others. We are capable of acting altruistically. But should we act altruistically? So in this section, we'll explore ethical egoism, which is the prescriptive theory that you should always act in your self-interest. So be careful not to confuse psychological and ethical egoism. Okay, so here's the theory. According to universal ethical egoism, you should only act in your self-interest. The ethical egoist does not believe you should pursue the interest of others as well as your own interest. Rather, they believe you should only pursue your interest. So an egoist believes that what makes an action good is that it is good for me. Right? Now, it's important to avoid caricatures and straw man versions of ethical egoism. So, for example, the ethical egoist does not believe you should be a Scrooge. Most egoists believe you should sometimes help others, but you should help them only because it's in your interest. So, for example, an ethical egoist may think it's good to scratch another's back, but only because this act is somehow in his rational self-interest. For example, the other will scratch his back in return. So according to ethical egoism, the fact that an action is in my self-interest is precisely what makes it good. Now, it's also important to see that ethical egoists can live disciplined lives. So for example, most ethical egoists will attempt to stop smoking because they recognize smoking is not in their long-term self-interest and is therefore bad. So ethical egoism does not support doing whatever you feel. Rather, it encourages you to follow your objective and rational self-interest, your real self-interest. Now, ethical egoists do make moral judgments, right? For example, most ethical egoists will judge the murderer as wrong because it's rarely in one's long-term self-interest to murder. Now, some will also argue it's bad because the object of the murderer's self-interest is bad, and that is, the ethical egoist seems to believe there are good and bad forms of self-interested activity. And as we'll see later, that might be a problem for it. But for now, we want to just get this stronger version of ethical egoism clearly laid out in our minds, right? Now, you can also distinguish between individual ethical egoism and universal ethical egoism. Individual ethical egoism is the idea that everyone ought to serve my interests, right? And act as good only if it benefits me, and morality dies when I die. Universal ethical egoism is the idea that everyone ought to seek their own self-interest, not just me. And this is a stronger form, this universal form of ethical egoism, because it includes everyone, not just myself. And so this video will focus mostly on universal ethical egoism. Okay, so why do people like ethical egoism? Well, let's look at several reasons. First, the ethical egoist recognizes that the only thing you own is your life. There's nothing wrong with being selfish or self-interested because you are nurturing your only real possession, your life. So you shouldn't buy into the myth that self-denial is a virtue, says the ethical egoist. Those who tell you otherwise are probably just trying to manipulate you to get what they want. So for example, they might encourage you to be altruistic, but only so they can parasitically live off your work, right? So in short, preserving your life in your interest is all you have, and that's all you should pursue, says the ethical egoist. Here's a second reason. According to some versions of laissez-faire economics, the world would be a better place if everyone pursued their own self-interests. So for example, let's say I self-interestedly create a convenience store or a hot dog stand to make money. The consequence of my action is that you benefit from my pursuit of self-interest, since you now have a convenience store or hot dogs, right? So the world works better when we each mind our own business while pursuing self-interest. Therefore, we should each pursue our own self-interest. That's another reason people are drawn to ethical egoism. Here's a third reason. People are also drawn to it because it's consistent with many moral beliefs. For example, it's consistent with helping others. According to ethical egoism, it's right to help others because it's usually in your self-interest to help them. Even religious morality seems to be based on self-interest, at least some of the time. So, for example, many religious people do good because they believe there is a God, a heaven, a hell, or a moral force like karma that makes it in their long-term self-interest to do good. So perhaps all of morality can be derived from self-interest. And so people may be drawn to ethical egoism for that reason. Here's another reason. Some ethical egoists believe altruistic acts, like giving to charity, or they believe that they are degrading and condescending to the people who receive this charity. It's degrading to constantly give people fish instead of teaching them to fish. So that is, altruism conceals a sick desire to make other people dependent on you. And the remedy is to be transparent. Transparently, each person should, without shame, seek his or her self-interest. Now, some egoists argue that since every living creature seeks self-preservation, every living creature ought to only seek their self-preservation, right? So they seek it, so they ought to seek it. Very interesting line of argument. And then finally, some ethical egoists are psychological egoists, and they believe science has made it obvious that everyone is always seeking self-interest, so they should always seek them. That is, they attempt to derive an ought from an is. Now, you can see my second video on psychological egoism for problems with that argument. Now, many of these arguments come from Ayn Rand, especially The Virtue of Selfishness, or Atlas Shrugged, or The Fountainhead. Some also come from Nietzsche, Thomas Hobbes, and from just people you might meet in the street, right? So now that you've seen some of the reasons for ethical egoism, the question is, do you think it's a strong ethical theory? If it's a strong ethical theory, it should be able to, 1, explain or be consistent with your core moral beliefs, and 2, it should help you lead a meaningful and flourishing life. So discussing the following questions will help you analyze and evaluate this ethical egoism. Okay, so the first question is, imagine it's in your self-interest to kill someone for life insurance money. You absolutely know that you could get away with it for reasons we need not explore. Now, in your moral opinion, is it morally permissible to kill this innocent person for money? Now, almost every person I meet says it's wrong to kill someone for money, even if they believe it's in their self-interest. And this is a problem for ethical egoism because according to ethical egoism, it should be good because it's in your self-interest. So the existence of even one self-interested act that you think is bad proves that ethical egoism is not the whole of your moral story. It doesn't explain all of your moral beliefs. Now, you may have some objections to the life insurance case, but the point is that you probably believe some actions are wrong even though they're in your self-interest. You could probably find other examples. Like, let's say you had to eat babies to survive or something. I don't know. Okay? But the point is this first criticism is that ethical egoism is inconsistent with what you believe is right or wrong. Again, most people would say something is wrong with the killing, even if they aren't sure what is wrong. But there's nothing wrong if ethical egoism is true, because it's in your self-interest. Therefore, most people hold beliefs that are inconsistent with ethical egoism. Right? So that's the first line of criticism. So here's a nice question. Survey your moral mind. Can you find examples of acts that you think are wrong, even though they are in your self-interest? And if you can, that's a problem for ethical egoism. Okay, let's look at the second argument, or the second question. So consider the following argument for ethical egoism. If I pursue my own self-interest, then everyone benefits. Therefore, it's good to pursue my own self-interest. This is the convenience store or hot dog argument we saw earlier. Now, the problem is this argument supports utilitarianism, not ethical egoism. So if pursuing my interest is good because everyone benefits, then it's not good simply because I benefit. But if I don't believe it's good simply because I benefit, then I'm not an ethical egoist. In this case, I would be a utilitarian. Right? So for example, if I pursue my self-interest of earning money by building a convenience store, then your self-interest may also be served since you now have a neighborhood convenience store. But I'm not an ethical egoist if I argue it's good because both you and I benefit. As an ethical egoist, I must say it's good only because I benefit. So ethical egoism may be true, but this type of argument doesn't support it because it presupposes caring for others for their own sake, not simply because it's in my self-interest. Right? So in my experience, most ethical egoists are not really ethical egoists because they believe such acts are good, partly because everyone benefits, not just themselves. And if they believe it's good, partly because everyone benefits, and they're not just believing that they believe that because when everyone benefits, they'll benefit, but if they believe it's partly good simply because everyone benefits, then they're not ethical egoists. Okay, let's look at the third question here. So this question brings up another objection, and the question is, why should ethical egoists care about posterity? And it seems according to ethical egoists, they shouldn't care about posterity. They should only care about their self-interest. An ethical egoist shouldn't care about the future and posterity because he'll be dead in the future. He's no longer there. So if an ethical egoist counters that their self includes their grandchildren and posterity, notice how the meaning of self has been greatly inflated now to meet this posterity objection. If one allows this inflated definition of self, the theory is now closer to utilitarianism, not ethical egoism. So in short, why should I care about posterity if there's nothing in it for me, nothing in my self-interest? But I do care. So ethical egoism, at least one version of it, seems to be inconsistent with my core moral beliefs about obligations to the future. Right? Okay, let's look at the next question. Do your interests count for more than other people's interests just because they are your interest? Okay, so this is a deep criticism of ethical egoism. In the Elements of Moral Philosophy, James Rachels argues that this is the deepest criticism of ethical egoism. He believes the egoist thinks like racists and sexists because they believe their interests ultimately count for more simply because they are in the right race or gender. That is, there is us and them, and we're better because we're us and they are them, so we can treat them however we please. Right? Now, ethical egoists categorize people in the same way. They say, there's me, and there's everyone else. And my interests count for more simply because they're mine. So if you were to ask an egoist why their interests count for more, they would say, well, because they're my interest. Right? But this answer is no better than the racist answer, that my group is better because it's my group. This is James Rachel's point, right? Now, think of all the people you've encountered today. Do their interests not count? Don't you care about them? Don't others have feelings and goals and pains and pleasures and interests just like you? Why should your pain count for more than their pain just because it's your pain? Right? So isn't the starving child sometimes on par with your own interests? And I think the answer is yes, and so you're probably more utilitarian than egoist. But let's say you save some money to buy a video game, but then you give it up to feed a starving child. Is this not a good act, in your opinion? And is this not a case of letting another person's interests outweigh your own interest? Okay, let's say the child is not starving. She just wants a new bicycle. In this case, your interest may outweigh the child's because you choose to buy the video game for yourself. Right? So the point is that it's too simplistic to say morality is always based on self-interest. When you think morally, you are considering your interests, but you're also considering the interest of others for their own sake. Right? Now, of course, it doesn't follow from these examples that you must always sacrifice your own interests. Rather, it shows that the interests of other people count too in your moral mind. As Lawrence Hinman says, self-love is a virtue, but it's not the only virtue. So, in a way, I think this criticism shows that ethical egoists, or ethical egoism, doesn't even enter the moral sphere's thinking. Because moral thinking begins when we start considering other people's interests for their own sake, and not simply our own interests. So the fifth question brings up the next criticism. And the fifth question is, do ethical egoists present a false dilemma in arguing that you should always be altruistic or always egoistic? Can one be both at the same time? So again, I think you can be both at the same time. And self-love is a virtue, but it's not the only virtue, right? So let's begin by exploring how the same act can be both altruistic and egoistic. So this comes from Lawrence Hinman in San Diego. Now, let's say a grenade lands in the trench. I may throw the grenade to save myself and my buddies. This act seems both self-interested, because I'm saving myself, and altruistic. I'm saving buddies, right? Trying to. Okay, second scenario. Let's say I jump on the grenade. This seems very altruistic, but not nearly as self-interested as the first act. Okay, let's look at the third act. I may watch the grenade explode. Now this seems really low on both altruism and self-interested behavior, right? And the fourth scenario, I may run away without warning my buddies. And that seems very selfish, very low on altruism, very high on selfish. So here's the point. The point is that egoists present a false dichotomy because they believe actions and motives must be entirely self-interested or entirely altruistic. But this is too simplistic. Morality is more complex than this. Again, here's another example. I may help the old lady across the street because I care about her and because I want the nickel that she's going to give me. Right? So I have more than one motive there. One might be more selfish and one more altruistic. Okay, let's say I become a teacher because I want to learn. I enjoy it. And I also want to help others. And I want to make money. And I want to improve my reputation or whatever. It's rare to find an act or a motive that's purely altruistic or purely self-interested. Right? Also, remember, sometimes it seems good to give up your interests, like feeding a starving child, and sometimes it's not good, to give up your interests, like staying in a toxic relationship. And this point is an Aristotelian one. Morality is a mean between the extremes. Morality is not about always surrendering your self-interest, nor is it about always pursuing your self-interest. Moral thinking means you are weighing all interests and sometimes choosing your interest over others and sometimes choosing the interest of others over your own. So it seems the ethical egoist is a bit extreme and they present this false dichotomy. Okay, here's the sixth question. If morality begins when we consider the interest of other people and not just one's own interest, are ethical egoists capable of moral thinking? All right. Well, the answer seems no. Many ethicists believe morality begins with the common point of view, with considering other people's interests for their own sake. So if I believe only my interests count, I never enter the moral sphere. Now, of course, most ethical egoists are probably moral. I think that's true. They want to do good things and give to charity and be self-sufficient and so on. But I think they're moral in a logically inconsistent way because ethical egoism at a deep level contradicts their moral beliefs. Right? So perhaps they haven't even entered the moral sphere, kind of like a 2-year-old, right, that thinks it's all about me, me, me. Okay, question 7 brings up the next criticism, and it's this. According to ethical egoism, should the hero be morally praised for jumping on a grenade to save 5 people? Okay, and it seems like no, his act is bad because he was not acting in his objective self-interest. According to ethical egoism, he sacrificed his self-interest. Right? After all, he jumped on the grenade and he's dead. He's killing himself. And this is especially clear if he's an atheist soldier and doesn't believe in a self-interested afterlife, right? But according to ethical egoism, we should not think such an act is morally praiseworthy, right? Because we believe everyone should act according to their self-interest. And you'll find people like Ayn Rand, ethical egoists, condemning such acts, right? The atheist soldier probably did not act according to his self-interest since he is killing himself, right? The egoist has to really inflate the meaning of self-interest to argue that he's somehow seeking his self-interest by killing himself, by killing all of his interest. So this seems to present a problem for ethical egoism. The idea that you think it's a heroic act, but if you think about ethical egoism, it seems to be a bad act. All right. The next question is number 8. Can ethical egoists be good friends? Well, perhaps. It depends on what you mean by friendship. However, the answer is no if you believe true friendship means caring about your friend's good for their own sake, not simply for the self-interested benefit you receive from him or her. So this type of true friendship seems to be beyond the reach of the egoist, to quote Hinman and Rachels and so on, because it requires one to sometimes transcend self-interest. So, indeed, the logically consistent ethical egoist should view true friendship as bad because it causes a person to act in non-self-interested ways. Furthermore, a logically consistent ethical egoist may even seek to harm his friends if it suddenly becomes in his self-interest to do so. So, as Lawrence Hinman states, ethical egoism may be good in a world where each person is like individual atoms colliding with other atoms, other persons, but it's not so good if you believe in true friendship and true love. Okay, so question 9 says, what's the difference between selfish and self-interest? And this is just a clarifying question that can help you sort out what people mean. These words are very ambiguous, and again, it's helpful to know how people distinguish them. Some define selfish as that which is in your short-term pleasure, for example, smoking cigarettes, and self-interest is that which is in your objective long-term self-interest, right? So not smoking cigarettes. Okay, other people define selfish as seeking your own good without regard for others, so being excessively concerned with yourself. For example, I kill my way to the top. Okay. Now, they then define self-interest as seeking your own good, but not at any cost to others. So a self-interested person values justice and fairness and would not cheat their way to the top. Okay. A third way that people use these words is they use them equivalently. Some use selfish and self-interest in equivalent ways. Right? And then finally, other people equivocate between all these different meanings of selfish and self-interest, which makes for difficult reading sometimes. So when you're reading Ayn Rand, for example, you want to try to pin down what she means in each section of each essay or book by selfish and self-interest. Okay. All right, look at number 10. Should you tell others you are an ethical egoist? Okay, this is kind of a funny objection. Perhaps the answer is no, because it depends on what's in your self-interest. It might not be in your self-interest to others, or even to yourself, to say that you're an egoist or to think that you're an egoist. It might be in your self-interest to think that you're not an egoist, or it might be in your self-interest to not tell others, because when you tell others, they realize you don't care about them for their own sake. Okay, that's a tricky little objection there, the publicity objection. Now let's get to number 11. It says, how does the prisoner's dilemma affect ethical egoism? Now the prisoner's dilemma seems complex at first. I'm going to take a little more time to explain this one. Okay, so Merrill Flood and Melvin Drescher created the prisoner's dilemma in 1950. And think of it as a puzzle that originally had nuclear war implications, but also has moral implications. So imagine you and Mr. Jones have been arrested, and the jailer gives you the following options. If you and Jones both confess, you'll both get 5 years in prison. Okay. Option B. If you confess but Jones does not confess, then Jones gets 10 years in prison and you're immediately set free. Sounds good. Option C. If you do not confess but Jones does confess, Jones will be set free immediately and you'll get the 10 years. Okay. Sounds bad. And then finally, if neither of you confess, you'll both be set free after only 1 year. So you can see it on the little chart here. Now the jailer tells you that Mr. Jones is being offered the same deal, but you cannot communicate with Mr. Jones. Okay. Now the point is to think like an ethical egoist first here. And when you think like an egoist, it becomes clear that you should confess. And here's why. Either Jones will confess or he won't. And suppose he confesses. Then if you confess, you'll get 5 years. Whereas if you do not confess, you'll get 10. So if he confesses, you're better off confessing. On the other hand, suppose he doesn't confess. Then you are in this position. If you confess, you'll go free, whereas if you do not confess, you'll remain in prison for a year. Clearly then, even if Smith does not confess, you'll be better off if you do. Right? So if you confess. And then finally, therefore, the conclusion, finally, is you must confess because you get out of jail the soonest regardless of what he does. Regardless of what Jones does. Right? Now this sounds good, but there's a catch. Remember that Jones is being offered the same deal. So Rachel's explains it like this. Assuming he's not stupid, he'll reason in the same way and conclude that he should confess too. So you'll both confess and get 5 years. But if you had both done the opposite, each of you could have gotten out in only 1 year. And that's the catch. By rationally pursuing your own interests, you both end up worse off than if you had both acted differently. It's a paradoxical situation. You and Jones will both be better off if you simultaneously do what is not apparently in your individual self-interest. Notice then that wanting everyone to pursue their own self-interest is not in your self-interest. Rather, you should want others to sometimes give up some interest. But to achieve that, it seems you should give up self-interest as well, so they will trust you. So paradoxically, pursuing your self-interest involves sometimes giving up your self-interest. So you should cooperate. And maybe if that were a character trait, that would even be better. So you just instinctively cooperate instead of trying to rationally determine your self-interest. So the prisoner's dilemma leads to a paradox very similar to the paradox of happiness, which is the idea that we find happiness when we stop seeking it. Happiness comes as a byproduct when we seek to be excellent or good, not when we seek happiness itself. So to quote this poem, it says, "I sought the bird of bliss, and she flew away. I sought my neighbor's good, bliss flew my way." Right? So Louis Pointman adds that the paradox of egoism is that to reach the goal of egoism, one must give up egoism and become, to some extent, an altruist, the very antithesis of egoism. So it seems that you could be a second-order egoist while being a first-order altruist, since it's in your self-interest to sometimes not act in your self-interest. Now, you could try to get others to be altruistic and use these sheep for your own self-interest, but people usually catch on, and so it doesn't seem to be in your long-term interest to live that way. However, game theory has shown that this is sometimes a successful strategy. That is, you should cheat if you can get away with it. You should confess if you are pretty sure Jones won't confess. But is this sort of calculation what you want to call moral thinking? The amoralist and the egoist calculate what is in their self-interest and act accordingly. In one situation, it may be in their interest to take advantage of the altruistic sheep, and they will act accordingly. In another situation, it will benefit them to act altruistically, and they'll do so. The problem is it may be difficult for people who are not narcissists or sociopaths, okay, to live this way. To quote Pointman, it may be difficult to turn altruism on and off like a faucet. It seems altruism is a natural or acquired character trait that many people cannot turn on and off like a faucet. It also seems that many people have a different view of morality. Most people feel it's just wrong to kill, lie, and cheat, even when it's in their self-interest to do so, and they know they would not get caught. But again, an egoist could take a second-order position here and seek to slowly mold their character, and their children's character, to be less self-interested from moment to moment. That is, it may benefit them to train themselves to believe some acts are good, regardless of whether they serve their self-interest. So the prisoner dilemma is interesting in ethics because it shows ethical egoism can be more complex than simply calculating what's in one's self-interest from moment to moment. It should cause the egoist to pause and think more deeply about their position. I don't think it's a devastating criticism of ethical egoism, as the other criticisms are, but it should help them think more deeply about how to maximize their interests, and that may involve creating altruistic character traits. Right? So humans are interesting partly because we can desire to desire. We can wish to change our character. In theoretical moments, an ethical egoist may even, somewhat paradoxically, have a self-interested second-order desire to have a character with first-order desires that are highly altruistic. But even with these distinctions, the fundamental question here with ethical egoism is whether you should always act in a self-interested way. And these criticisms answer no. Your morality is not founded solely on self-interest. Right? From the beginning of this video, remember, ethical egoism reminds us that self-interest is a virtue, but it's not the only virtue. To flourish, we should seek self-interest, but not just self-interest. Thanks.